Last call for the American dream. Clears throat. The year is 1919. The Great War has ended, and the doughboys are home, pockets jingling with victory bonuses, and ears still ringing with the jazz that has followed them across the Atlantic. In Brooklyn, a wiry young Sicilian immigrant named Salvatore Lucania, soon to restyle himself Charles Lucky Luciano, leans against a lamppost outside the Harvard Inn, studying the flow of sailors and flappers with the patience of a man who already sees tomorrow's opportunity. Inside the same borough, another immigrant, Arnold Rothstein, sits in a velvet-curtained back room, shuffling a deck of cards with surgeon-like precision. He is known as the Brain, the man who fixed the 1919 World Series, and tonight he is calculating odds that have nothing to do with baseball. Meanwhile, across the East River, a broad-shouldered teenager named Alphonse Capone drives a rickety truck for Frankie Yale, ferrying barrels of beer from clandestine breweries to basement saloons. He is 20 years old, scarred on the left cheek from a brawl in Coney Island, and he already dreams of bigger loads, louder cities, and fatter payrolls. While these future kings of crime sharpen their ambitions, a very different army is marching. Carrie Nation's hatchet-wielding spirit lives on in the Woman's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League, whose lobbyists glide through state houses like Methodists on a mission from God. On January 16, 1919, Nebraska becomes the 36th state to ratify the 18th Amendment. At exactly 1 minute past midnight on January 17, 1920, every brewery, distillery, and saloon in the United States will be ordered to fall silent. In Milwaukee, the Pabst and Schlitz families watch million-gallon copper kettles go cold. In Kentucky, bourbon barons lock iron gates over limestone aging caves. And in New York, Dutch Schultz stares at the shuttered doors of his favorite speakeasy and mutters, "They just made me a millionaire." The Volstead Act, passed on October 28, 1919, defines intoxicating liquor as anything stronger than 0.5% alcohol. Suddenly, every kitchen in America becomes a potential still, every basement a secret cellar. The Coast Guard, once tasked with rescuing sailors, now trains its binoculars on rum-running ships creeping up from Nassau and Havana. In Chicago, Johnny Torrio stands on the roof of the Four Deuces Club, surveying the South Side's grid of streets like a general plotting supply lines. He knows the city's thirst will not vanish with legislation. It will simply change direction. On the eve of the dry law, Frank Nitti counts crates of Canadian Club whiskey hidden beneath a North Side funeral home. In Detroit, the Purple Gang rehearses hijack routes along the frozen Detroit River. And in Washington, a young Prohibition agent named Elliot Ness polishes his badge and wonders how many bullets the Constitution is worth. The final midnight strikes. Bartenders lock doors for what they believe is the last time. But across the river in Hoboken, a tugboat slips into the darkness, carrying 40 cases of bonded scotch. The experiment has begun, and already the cracks are widening into canyons. Bootleg Bonanza, the first 1,000 miles. The moment the padlocks clicked shut on January 17, 1920, every empty bottle in America became a gold mine waiting to reopen. Within 48 hours, the first whispered passwords began circulating through tenement stairwells. In Jersey City, dock workers spoke of a schooner riding low in the water, its hold packed with amber liquid that smelled of sugar cane and rebellion. Captain William McCoy watched the shoreline from the deck of the Arethusa, calculating tides and bribe schedules with the precision of a naval commander. His rum came straight from Nassau, uncut and perfect, earning the nickname that would outlive every temperance law, the real McCoy. At $20 a case, he sold 300 crates before sunrise to men who would mark them up 400% by nightfall. While McCoy ruled the Atlantic approaches, Detroit's Purple Gang discovered that hijacking beer trucks paid better than any factory job in 1921. The Bernstein brothers didn't just steal the cargo, they stole the entire distribution network.
forcing drivers to choose between bullets and allegiance. Within 6 months, they controlled every drop of beer flowing between Windsor and the Motor City, establishing the first interstate liquor pipeline. In New York's financial district, Arnold Rothstein sat in his Madison Avenue office, transforming chaos into corporate structure. The gambler who fixed the 1919 World Series now fixed prices across Manhattan, bankrolling rum fleets and basement breweries with Wall Street efficiency. His ledgers showed what every politician already knew. Prohibition wasn't a moral crusade, it was the greatest business opportunity in American history. Meyer Lansky perfected the numbers that made it all work, creating bookkeeping systems so precise that even federal accountants couldn't unravel them. Every dollar that crossed his desk was laundered through legitimate businesses, garment factories, delicatessens, even funeral parlors, before emerging clean as morning snow. His methods would become the template for organized crime's financial operations for the next 50 years. By 1922, speakeasies outnumbered legal saloons 3-1 across America. Teenage lookouts stood on street corners with whistles and nickel-plated .38s, earning more in a night than their fathers made in a week at the docks. The passwords changed nightly. Joe sent me became Charlie needs a haircut, became the moon is full over Hoboken. But the thirst never changed. In Chicago, Johnny Torrio watched the winter fog roll across Lake Michigan and saw opportunity floating on Canadian whiskey. His young lieutenant, Al Capone, handled the logistics, bribing every sheriff between Cicero and Kenosha with rolls of cash thick as telephone books. Each successful run across the ice wrote another chapter in what would become the modern American Mafia's operating manual. They established supply chains stretching from Montreal distilleries to Chicago basements, creating territorial treaties that carved cities into criminal fiefdoms. When disputes arose, they didn't settle them in court. They settled them with Tommy guns and precision drive-bys that would define urban warfare for generations. The first citywide price-fixing cartels emerged not in boardrooms, but in backroom deals where blood was cheaper than bail. Every successful shipment taught new lessons: how to time Coast Guard patrols, which customs agents stayed bored, where to hide 1,000 cases in plain sight. By 1923, the American underworld had evolved from street gangs into multinational corporations with better logistics than Standard Oil. They had created something unprecedented in human history, a black market so efficient that it could quench the thirst of an entire nation while making its operators richer than their wildest criminal dreams. Chicago, 1923, is a city of smoke and shadows, carved like a pie into bleeding slices. Johnny Torrio, small, immaculate, and soft-spoken, rules the South Side from the Loop down to the stockyards as though he were a quiet duke in a grey flannel suit. But across the river, Dion O'Banion, the Irish florist with a choir boy face and a heart like broken glass, controls the North Side Vice District and every barrel of beer that flows through it. The two men had once toasted one another in the back room of Schofield's flower shop on North State Street, a place where funeral wreaths doubled as coded messages. In October of 1924, O'Banion agreed to sell Torrio a brewery in the suburb of Stickney for $500,000, then double-crossed him by tipping federal agents the night before the takeover. Torrio lost the cash, the plant, and his patience in a single stroke. 3 weeks later, on the morning of November 10th, O'Banion was clipping chrysanthemums for a customer when two gunmen in long coats stepped inside. 6 bullets ended the florist's life, the echo swallowed by the fragrance of roses. The first great gang war of Prohibition had begun. Torrio, riding in his armor-plated Lincoln, was ambushed outside his apartment on South Clyde Avenue in January 1925. Shotguns roared, buckshot shredded his chauffeur, and a slug tore through Torrio's jaw and lung. He survived, But in the white hush of a February ward, he summoned the 26-year-old prodigy he had once brought up from Brooklyn like a prized colt. Al Capone, 270 pounds of silk-shirted ambition, leaned close as Torrio whispered the arithmetic of power. $70 million a year, 1,000 speakeasies, breweries hidden in forest preserves, aldermen on retainers. The older man pressed a brass key into Capone's palm, and with the same calm he once used to order executions, said, "It's all yours, Al. Run it like a business." Within weeks, Capone turned the patchwork of rackets into a vertical empire. He bought grain elevators in Indiana, fleets of trucks, and bottling plants that stamped counterfeit labels faster than Henry Ford stamped fenders. Every truck carried a numbered manifest, every bribe a code in the city ledger. $10 for a beat cop, $500 for a captain, $10,000 for a judge. To quiet the moralists, Capone opened soup kitchens on South Halsted, where the unemployed lined up for coffee and bread while jazz drifted from loudspeakers overhead. Newspapers called him the Robin Hood of the South Side. The city loved a generous tyrant. But across the river, George Bugs Moran inherited O'Banion's North Side and swore eternal revenge. His gunners prowled the borders, hijacking beer trucks, spraying roadhouses with Tommy gun fire, leaving brass shells glittering on the snow like spilled coins. By the summer of 1925, Chicago had become two armed camps separated by the Chicago River, a city bracing for a bloodier chapter than any of its founders could have imagined. The clock struck midnight in Harlem, 1926, and the Cotton Club's velvet curtains parted to reveal Duke Ellington's brass gleaming under red lamps. A waiter in white gloves glided between marble tables, balancing silver trays of amber liquid labeled "for medicinal purposes only." The trumpet hit a blue note, and the room swayed, skirts spinning, laughter echoing against mahogany walls. 400 miles east, Atlantic City's Ritz-Carlton basements pulsed with roulette wheels and chorus lines. Enoch Nucky Johnson stood at the center, yachting cap tilted rakishly, tuxedo immaculate, a mayor in everything but title. He raised a crystal glass to the city fathers, judges, and aldermen who toasted him by first name. Yet beneath the glamour, Chicago's nights were tightening like piano wire. Al Capone's Green Mill, on North Broadway, boasted a revolving bar that spun drinkers into shadowed corners. Hidden tunnels snaked beneath the Hawthorne smoke shop, leading to bolt holes and armories. Uniformed doormen greeted aldermen and police captains with winks and passwords whispered like prayers. Behind the bar, Frank Nitti balanced ledgers with a Luger tucked neatly into his waistcoat pocket. Every shipment from Canada or the Caribbean risked hijacking on lonely roads. Bugs Moran's North Side gunners crouched behind roadside billboards, Tommy guns ready, waiting for Capone's beer trucks. When the shooting started, glass bottles burst like fireworks, foam mixing with blood on the gravel. The price of a drink climbed faster than the stock market, yet Americans drank more than ever. In the Bronx, Dutch Schultz converted entire tenement blocks into humming breweries. Steam rose from rooftop vents, masking the stench of malt and gunpowder. Schultz's accountants calculated profits in back rooms where safes bulged with cash. Across the river in Manhattan, Lucky Luciano summoned the bosses to a quiet suite at the Waldorf Astoria. "No more bullets over street corners," he murmured, laying out the first commission. Meyer Lansky, calm as a banker, argued territories like stock options. The agreement was simple: divide the city, share the ports, and keep the politicians paid. Down in Washington, Elliot Ness clipped a badge to his lapel and stared at photographs of Capone smiling outside the Metropole Hotel. He knew every jazz riff masked a gunshot, every champagne cork a bribe. Still, the bands played on, brass blaring defiance into the smoky dark. The Cotton Club's chorus kicked higher, heels flashing like switchblades. In Chicago, Capone raised a glass to the mirror behind his private booth, toasting his own reflection and the city he believed he owned. Outside, winter wind rattled the windows, but inside, gin flowed like liquid gold. A saxophone wailed a blue note that sounded almost like mourning. Because everyone knew the party could not last forever. Yet for one more night, America danced on the edge of a volcano, jazz and gunfire sharing the same heartbeat.
By the first breath of 1927, Chicago's streets no longer echoed with jazz. They rang with gunfire. Bugs Moran's North Side gang had turned the delivery routes into killing fields. Every Tuesday and Friday, Capone's beer convoys rolled south from the Hawthorne smoke shop, guarded by shotgun riders who prayed harder than they fought. Moran's men knew the schedule. They knew the drivers. They knew the exact mile marker where the road curved past the stockyards, and the smell of slaughter masked the scent of ambush. On February 14th, they struck again. But Capone was done playing defense. From his suite on the 5th floor, he summoned Frank Nitti and laid out a map of the North Side like a general planning a siege. The Lexington had become his fortress. Armored Cadillacs idled outside 24 hours a day, engines growling like chained beasts. Moran answered with a brazen assault. A bullet meant for Capone ricocheted off the bronze elevator door and buried itself in the mahogany paneling beside a startled bellhop. Al was in Miami by then, sipping iced tea behind palm frond curtains, but Chicago still bled. Nitti ran the war from a back room at the Metropole Hotel, tallying corpses like a grocer counts apples. The city recorded 133 gang murders in 1928 alone, one every 60 hours. Witnesses vanished. A saloon keeper who identified a gunman disappeared after supper and was found floating in the Chicago River with nickel-sized holes in both temples. The press called it a civil war fought with pineapple grenades and armor-plated limousines. In Washington, a soft-spoken federal accountant named Frank Wilson opened a fresh ledger. He had no badge, no gun, only a stubborn certainty that numbers told truer stories than bullets. While Moran's gunmen sprayed Archer Avenue with lead, Wilson traced wire transfers from a Miami bank to a quiet apartment above a dry-cleaning shop on South Wabash. Each deposit was small, 5,000, 10, but they arrived weekly, like clockwork, signed with the same looping initial, AC7. Back in Chicago, winter tightened its grip. Moran's last convoy raid ended in disaster when Capone's men rolled out a mounted Browning machine gun from a furniture truck. The North Side gang left 3 dead and 5 wounded, their blood mixing with spilled beer until the gutters ran pink. By spring, the Lexington's elevator doors bore 17 fresh dents, each a silent testament to the war fought one floor above the tourists checking in for a quiet weekend. Capone returned briefly in May, stepping off the 20th Century Limited, with a tan and a Panama hat, smiling for photographers as if he'd been on holiday. Behind the smile, orders went out. Finish Moran before the World's Fair of 1933 gave Chicago new eyes. In June, Nitti rented a warehouse on Clark Street and began stockpiling pineapple grenades bought from a crooked National Guard armory in Indiana. The city's grand jury convened, but every subpoena returned empty. No one dared speak the name Capone aloud. Yet far from the gunfire, Frank Wilson's quiet pencil moved across page after page, totaling columns that would soon speak louder than any Tommy gun. The war on the North Side raged through the summer of 28, but the real battle was already shifting, from bullets to balance sheets, from blood to numbers that never forgot. Dawn crawled over the snow-crusted rooftops of Chicago's North Side on St. Valentine's Day, 1929. A sharp wind whipped off Lake Michigan, carrying the smell of coal smoke and something sharper, gun oil. In the garage at 2223 North Clark, 7 men of the Moran gang, Pete Gusenberg, Frank Gusenberg, Adam Heyer, Albert Weinshank, James Clark, John May, and Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer, waited for a truckload of hijacked Canadian whiskey. They stamped their feet against the cold, cigarettes glowing like tiny red stars. At 9:40 that morning, a black Cadillac touring car eased to the curb. Two men in Chicago police uniforms stepped out, followed by two more in civilian overcoats and fedoras. They carried shotguns and Thompson submachine guns. The uniformed men pushed open the garage door and barked the command every gangster dreaded. "Hands up, you're under arrest." Believing it was a routine shakedown, the seven lined up facing the brick wall. 90 seconds later, 70 rounds of .45 caliber fire turned bricks into chalk dust and bodies into headlines. The Thompsons chattered like mechanical laughter. When the echoes died, the shooters marched their prisoners out the front, only to vanish into the Cadillac and disappear forever. Blood pooled across the oil-stained floor, dripping between floorboards. Frank Gussenberg, riddled with 14 bullets, still clung to life long enough to tell police, "Nobody shot me." George Bugs Moran was late that morning. He would later claim he saw the police car and kept walking. The Carney-style execution horrified a nation already weary of blood-soaked streets. Headlines screamed from newsstands, "Slaughter in Chicago." President Herbert Hoover, vacationing in Florida, demanded action. Chicago Mayor William Hale Thompson, under pressure, appointed Special Prosecutor Edwin Olson. Meanwhile, an obscure federal agent named Elliot Ness was summoned to Washington. He would form a small squad of untouchables pledged to stay bribe-proof. Al Capone, lounging in the sun at his Palm Island estate, laughed when reporters reached him by telephone. "Only Capone kills like that," he boasted, a line that would become his epitaph. Yet the joke rang hollow even to his own men. Frank Nitti, now running day-to-day operations, knew the heat would be relentless. In New York, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky watched the headlines and shook their heads. Dutch Schultz wired from the Bronx, "Get out of Chicago before they nail you." The massacre did not end the beer war. It ended the public's patience. Within days, Congress doubled appropriations for Prohibition enforcement. Grand juries convened. And in a quiet Treasury office, Frank Wilson's pencil kept moving, totaling columns that would soon speak louder than any Tommy gun. The gunshot heard round the world had been fired, but the echo would travel straight to a federal courthouse and to a cell in Alcatraz. In the spring of 1930, the federal government changed its strategy. If they could not convict Alphonse Capone for the blood on the streets, they would convict him for the money in his ledgers. Treasury agent Frank J. Wilson, a quiet man with rimless spectacles, assembled a small task force inside the Internal Revenue Bureau's Chicago field office. Their weapons were not Tommy guns, but adding machines and subpoenas. Wilson's first break came from an unexpected place: a green felt gambling table seized in a December 1929 raid on the Hawthorne Smoke Shop in Cicero. Hidden beneath the table was a slender memorandum book, its pages dense with penciled figures. Each entry recorded a daily skim from slot machines, blackjack tables, and horse parlors, money never declared to the government. Wilson matched the totals to bank deposits traced through aliases: A. Costa, A. X. Rossaldella, Rogers, even the playful Al Brown. By midsummer, the Chicago Crime Commission, a private watchdog group, officially branded Capone Public Enemy Number 1. The label stuck like tar. Capone, ever the showman, invited reporters to his suite at the Lexington Hotel and offered to settle his debt with the Treasury. "I'll pay every cent, plus interest," he boasted, lighting a thick cigar. But the Treasury Department, led by Secretary Andrew Mellon, refused to bargain. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury returned an indictment charging Capone with 22 counts of tax evasion, totaling over $200,000 in unreported income. The trial began on October 6 before federal judge James H. Wilkerson in a guarded Chicago courtroom.
Capone arrived in a cinnamon-colored suit, diamond tie-pin flashing, flanked by bodyguards.
Inside, the government's case was dry but devastating. Bookkeepers testified under protection, ledgers were projected onto a screen, and bank officers identified deposits traced to Capone's aliases. Capone's defense, that his income came from gambling, not taxable wages, collapsed under cross-examination. After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 5 counts. Judge Wilkerson, a stern man with a white mustache, sentenced Capone to 11 years in federal prison, a $50,000 fine, and court costs. The courtroom erupted in cheers from reporters as deputies snapped handcuffs around the gangster's thick wrists. Capone was whisked to Cook County Jail, then transferred to Atlanta Penitentiary, and finally to the new island fortress of Alcatraz. Behind bars he faded, syphilis eroding body and mind. With the Titan gone, the Chicago outfit splintered. Frank Nitti, nicknamed the Enforcer, stepped into the vacuum but lacked Capone's charisma. Meanwhile, in New York, Charles Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky studied the wreckage of Prohibition. They saw that blood drew headlines, but paperwork drew prison time. The two men quietly forged a national syndicate built on gambling, labor unions, and the hard lessons learned during the dry decade. Prohibition would be repealed in December 1933, yet the empire it created would endure long after the last speakeasy door swung shut. December 5th, 1933. A telegram clattered into Salt Lake City at 3:17 in the afternoon, and within minutes the nation knew. The 36th star on the Repeal banner had been sewn. The word raced across telegraph wires faster than any bootleg convoy ever rolled, and by nightfall, every city from Bangor to San Diego rang with the clink of legal beer mugs. But the celebration tasted bittersweet. 13 years earlier, the Dry Crusaders had promised a moral rebirth. Instead, they had midwifed a colossus. In Atlanta Penitentiary, Alphonse Capone heard the news on a crackling radio in the recreation yard. He was 44 years old, but syphilis had carved trenches in his memory, and his handshake trembled like an old man's. The king of Chicago beer had traded a throne for a cell, and the empire he once toasted with diamond-studded flasks now belonged to men who had never fired a Tommy gun. Frank Nitti, sleek in a dove-gray suit, stepped into the vacuum with accountant's eyes. While Capone rotted, Nitti turned murder into math, converting street muscle into silent partners inside breweries, racetracks, and laundry unions. 300 miles east, in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, Charles Lucky Luciano spread blueprints across a mahogany table. Meyer Lansky leaned over his shoulder, slide rule in hand, calculating how many dice tables could fit into a desert that no lawman yet dreamed of policing. The two men had learned a brutal lesson from Torrio and Rothstein. Violence was a cost, not a product. On a rainy May night in 1934, they convened the first meeting of what the underworld would soon call the Commission. 7 families seated like corporate directors, voting on territories the way Standard Oil once carved pipelines. Across the river in Brooklyn, Dutch Schultz raged against the new order. They want to turn us into Rotarians, he snarled, but a volley of bullets in the palace chop house that autumn silenced his protest and etched the Commission's authority in blood and neon. The speakeasies that had hidden behind fake bookstores and funeral parlors now swung open their doors with brass plaques and liquor licenses. Same mahogany bars, same brass rails, same cash registers, only the receipts were now taxable. Oni Madden's Cotton Club moved from Harlem to Times Square, and the band played the same hot jazz, but the cover charge now included a line item for protection. Meanwhile, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, once a paper tiger with no arrest powers, sharpened its claws. Congress passed new laws in 1934 that turned tax evasion and interstate flight into federal felonies. and Hoover's G-men traded Model T Fords for armored sedans with two-way radios. Elliot Ness watched from Cleveland as the liquor cases dried up and the numbers racket boomed. He would chase slot machines instead of stills, discovering that the same trucks that once carried Canadian whiskey now carried Cuban narcotics with identical forged manifests. The lesson was carved in every city ledger. Prohibition had not ended crime. It had franchised it. The bootleggers' midnight convoys became the syndicate's morning milk runs, and the border between crime and commerce blurred like heat on a desert highway. On New Year's Eve, 1933, Americans raised glasses of legal champagne beneath confetti that looked suspiciously like shredded indictments. Few noticed the quiet men in camel hair coats standing at the edges of the crowd, tallying the take. The empire had outgrown the need for secret knocks and passwords. It now wore pinstripes and sat on zoning boards. When the last legal barrel rolled out of the Budweiser plant that December, it bore a federal tax stamp designed by the same Treasury artists who once forged Capone's death warrant. The country had traded Tommy guns for ticker tape, but the melody of profit played on, now orchestrated by men who understood that the real money was never in breaking laws, it was in making them.